Is it possible that the Jesus we meet in the temple this morning, weaving a whip of cords and driving out sheep and cattle, is doing so with a smile on his face? Is it possible that the Jesus we meet in the temple this morning, pouring out the money changers' coins and overturning their tables, is doing so with patient purposefulness? Is it possible that the Jesus we meet in the temple this morning, scattering doves and imploring the vendors to stop making this marketplace, is doing so with calm equanimity? Incidentally, full disclosure, I wrote this sermon when I was really angry. It was almost a spiritually disconcerting thing to do. I had adrenaline running through me as well as caffeine, and my mind was spinning up a scenario that I thought was playing out, which of course wasn't. And I was doing this as I was contemplating the scripture that we hear today, Jesus in the temple. And I wanted to weave a whip, though I wasn't smiling. I wanted to kick over some tables, though not with patient purposefulness. I wanted to drive people out, though not with calm equanimity. I wanted Jesus to be right there by my side. But he wasn't. Because Jesus doesn't get angry. While this part of the scripture is often cited as the place where Jesus does get angry, and I suspect that's because of the vigor of his actions rather than the content of his words, because there's nowhere in this pericope in which the word anger is used. Furthermore, you do not need to be angry to drive cattle and sheep out with a whip. All you farmers know that, right? It doesn't require anger to turn over tables. Doesn't necessitate anger to chase out money lenders or release doves. It's just that I wanted Jesus to be angry. And I wanted him to be angry because I get angry, and I was angry, and I wanted that connection so I could be like Jesus. That's one of the core precepts of Christianity, after all, isn't it? That we can be like Jesus, right? That we can live our lives as Jesus would if he had my life or if he had your life. And in my life, I get angry. But Jesus doesn't. One of my favorite theologians, Dallas Willard. Haven't talked about Dallas Willard for a while, have I? Dallas Willard says this: anything that can be done in anger can be done better in love. And that's the point of this sermon today. Anything that can be done in anger can be done better in love. Right? The simple answer to why this is that there is nothing stronger, there is nothing more powerful, there is nothing more enduring, there is nothing more effective than love. Am I right? Well, if you're not sure, hearken back to what Julie read this morning from the first letter of John. And let me quote: God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Because as God is, so are we in the world. Let's pause for a second and think about those words. As God is, so are we. And what does that mean? As God is, so are we. Well, what's God? God is love, right? And so if God is love, who is God? Choir. Oh dear, choir. I'm not going to ask again. So if God is love, then what does that make us? That makes us love as well. So if God is love, then we are as well. And anything done in anger can be better done in love. Now, you know what kind of love I'm talking about, right? In Greek, it is agape. We talk about that a lot here. It's the love that runs deeper than emotions and feelings. It's the love that comes from God and belongs to God and runs through every single human being, every single human soul that God has brought into the world. Because to be born is to have a soul. Love is the substance of the soul, and it cannot be added to or subtracted from. We can do nothing to diminish it or enhance it. The soul is perfect. The soul is full. The soul is complete, which is why Dallas Willard writes, anything done in anger can be better done in love. Now in 1 John, we go on to hear, there is no fear in love, and perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. In the temple, Jesus is not punishing. He is liberating. He is decoupling people from the idolatry that is getting in the way of their relationship with their soul, which means it's getting in the way of their relationship with God, which means their understanding of power and the purposefulness of love has been diminished by what they're doing because Jesus is liberating them out of love. Love is liberating. Anger is not. Anger is a flesh and blood emotion, a mortal perspective, driven through our physiology upon the wings of adrenaline. Which is why we're always supposed to pause before we send the email. If we were to hold balance like this, right? With the soul in one hand and the body in the other, we would feel the weight of the soul so much more significantly because it is bigger and eternal and more enduring than our bodies, which are wasting away. And so, when the adrenaline begins to rev, from where do you choose to reign? From mortality or eternity? From anger or from love? Dallas Willard recommends anything that's done in anger can be better done in love. Okay? So it's interesting, as I reflect back on my life a little bit in preparation for this sermon, I found there stamped in my memory very clearly the moments when I blew my stack in anger. And in every single situation, my anger did more harm to the relationship than it did to resolve the situation. There was never a time when love would not have been the better response. And here's the curious thing in all this, that I remember the moments of anger so much more vividly than the actions of love that I have carried out in my life over time. And here's why I suspect that to be the case. Since love is our eternal predisposition, since we were made by love, our souls shot through with love, then love is our most natural state of being. You with me? Which is why our memory need not dwell upon it. It's how we are. It's how we were made. It's the nature of our souls. Our mind instead is designed to dwell on the moments, when we indulged our anger. And finding in this reflection, if we do, both the ineptitude of our wrath and the wisdom of seeking a different strategy. So how does that happen? How do we seek a different strategy? How do we drive out cattle and sheep with a smile on our face? How do we tip over tables with a patient person? purposefulness? How do we invite vendors to vacate and doves to fly free in a state of calm equanimity? And more so, how can we do that when the adrenaline is coursing through our veins? It is completely possible. Because anything done in anger can be better done in love. And so, I'd like to recommend that we consider 4 things today, 4 things to think about when we find ourselves on the precipice of blowing our top. There's awareness, then understanding, followed by equanimity, and finally completed in compassion. You with me on that? There is awareness, and then understanding, equanimity, and compassion. Now we'll begin with awareness. I remember when I was a kid getting mad at my mom. And I would shout, "You're making me mad." To which she would respond, "I'm not making you mad, you're choosing to be mad." Which would really make me mad. Because anger is so self-indulgent, right? It's really about us, right? And anger is a choice. Noticing the ascent of anger within ourselves is important. Yes, adrenaline's a real thing, right? We are wired for survival. I understand, as you do as well, that fight and flight instinct, but really, that fight and flight instinct in our lives is rarely part of the regular pattern of our existence. And if you find yourself in a situation where you need to call up fight and flight, I can assure you, you will do so. Right? But mostly, the adrenaline we indulge is not about saving our lives. It is about punishing somebody else. And that has to do with fear, not love, as we hear in John's first letter today. And so the first step to transcending anger is noticing its surge and then not indulging it. That is awareness. Which moves us to the next step, understanding. Which is understanding what is provoking this anger. Right? Why am I triggered all of a sudden? What from my history is this tying back to? Am I feeling dishonored, rejected, disrespected, belittled, shamed? What are other times when I felt like this? Why am I indulging this anger? Why am I eating it up? Understanding in the moment can be very difficult, at least for me. Right? The spiritual exercise of learning to understand in the moment is called discernment. And if we are in the practice of discernment, if we are perpetually participating in an activity of discernment, like spiritual direction or small group participation or the examine or maybe a 12-step program, then we are much more capable of quickly gaining understanding in the face of that adrenaline surge. So we train to be people who can understand quickly in the midst of the surge. So when awareness and understanding are attained, then equanimity sets in. And for me, I know that equanimity is beginning to set in when a question presents itself. And that question that comes up as equanimity settles in is this: what is the worst thing that could happen here? And when I find that question come to mind, a settling begins to take place. When I contemplate the question, what is the worst thing that could happen here? And I run down that rabbit hole, I eventually meet God. I meet Jesus. And I start thinking about love and resurrection. And whenever I think about resurrection, I think about that definition we use for resurrection here. The bad thing is never the last thing. Bad thing is never the last thing. And then I understand that the worst thing that could ever happen in this situation could never really be, because the last thing will always be the same thing. And that is that we encounter the love of God in any situation. And this flips the script from anger to compassion. Compassion always asks the question, what can I do to help you? And suddenly there's this movement from self-indulgent retribution to soul-connecting empathy. And that is what we see happening in the temple. That's what we find going on with Jesus. Because Jesus saw people profoundly isolated from the love of God. He saw people who had no sense of their soul and its eternal beauty and goodness and power. And so in compassion, he drives out the sheep and the cattle with a smile on his face. And he overturns the tables to wipe away the idolatry that's sitting right there in front of him. And he uses the strength of his voice to call their attention to God. And he does this because Jesus is God. He is perfect love, and he loves every single soul. And he knows that the most important thing that exists in our life is the realization that as God is, so are we. We are all souls infused by the love of God, each and every single person. Therefore, by awareness, through understanding with equanimity, there flows compassion within the subterranean rivers of souls coming together to reveal a truth: that anything done in anger can be better done in love.